Just before sunrise, along a quiet stretch of White Cross Road outside Chapel Hill, North Carolina, someone notices a body lying near the side of the road. The air is cold. Everything is still. It's the kind of early morning where traffic hasn't fully picked up yet. Orange County deputies receive the call and head out to check on an unresponsive woman reported near the roadside. When they arrive, they find a young woman. She's been shot multiple times. There's nothing they can do. She's pronounced dead right there at the scene. At that point, it's handled like any other homicide investigation in its earliest stage. The area is secured, deputies block off part of the road, evidence markers begin to appear along the ground. Detectives move carefully, documenting everything, knowing that small details can matter later. For a while, there's very little information released publicly. Then investigators confirm who she is. The victim is Eve Marie Carson. She's 22 years old, and she isn't just any student. She's the sitting student body president at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The news spreads fast. According to reporting at the time from the News and Observer, the Charlotte Observer, CNN, and the Associated Press, students across campus begin hearing about it early that morning. Phones buzz, messages come in. People wake up to the kind of news that doesn't feel real at first. Faculty members learn that the same student who had been leading meetings, speaking on behalf of her classmates, and helping shape campus decisions is now the victim of a homicide investigation. It doesn't make sense, and it raises immediate questions. But as investigators continue working, they uncover something even more concerning. Eve hadn't simply disappeared on her own. She had been taken. Authorities determined she was last seen late the previous night at her off-campus apartment at Chapel Ridge Apartments. Sometime after midnight, someone confronted her inside her home. Later court testimony would state that she was forced at gunpoint into her own vehicle. Then came the surveillance footage. In the early morning hours, ATM cameras in Chapel Hill and nearby Durham captured images of Eve withdrawing money. In the footage, a man stands close beside her the entire time. The images are grainy, but clear enough to understand what's happening. She isn't alone, and she isn't there by choice. By mid-morning on March 5th, law enforcement agencies across the area are actively searching for answers. Chapel Hill Police, Orange County Sheriff's deputies, and other investigators begin canvassing everywhere connected to her final hours: her apartment complex, the ATM locations, and the stretch of White Cross Road where her body was found. On campus, students are told to stay alert. University officials acknowledge the seriousness of what's happened and confirm the investigation is ongoing. For many people, what made it especially unsettling was how unpredictable it felt. This wasn't tied to a known dispute. There hadn't been any public warning signs. It happened suddenly. And for students in Chapel Hill, it forced a difficult realization. Someone they knew, someone highly visible and deeply involved in their community, had been taken and killed. And at that moment, no one yet knew exactly why. Eve Carson wasn't an anonymous face on campus. People knew who she was. In 2007, she had been elected student body president, representing more than 25,000 students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It wasn't just a title. She met regularly with university administrators. She sat in meetings where real decisions were made. She spoke openly about student concerns and took that responsibility seriously. She was only weeks away from graduating, and now suddenly she was gone. Her parents, Bob and Teresa Carson, received the call no parent ever wants to get. Their daughter had been abducted. She had been killed. In interviews later covered by national media, they spoke about the shock of it, the way their lives shifted in a single moment. Just hours earlier, their focus had been on her future. Graduation. What came next? Instead, they were being told she had been shot and left on a rural road. As investigators continued releasing information, they confirmed that Eve had been shot 5 times. At that point, there were still more questions than answers. Was she targeted because of who she was? Was it random? Had someone been watching her? Or had everything unfolded quickly in a matter of minutes? By that evening, the campus had already begun to respond. Students organized candlelight vigils. They gathered together quietly, holding candles and printed photos of Eve, photos where she looked exactly how they remembered her, smiling, confident, fully present in her life. It was hard to reconcile those images with what had happened. News trucks lined Franklin Street. Reporters stood just steps away from the places Eve had walked every day. The story wasn't just about violence. It was about how close it had come. This wasn't distant. This was personal. She had been part of the daily rhythm of the campus. Behind the scenes, investigators were working fast. They had surveillance footage. They had records from the ATM withdrawals. They had her vehicle information. And piece by piece, they were building a timeline of her final hours. Within 48 hours, arrests would be made. But on that first day, none of that had happened yet. There were no suspects publicly named, no court hearings, no explanations. There was only what people knew for certain. A 22-year-old student leader had been taken from her apartment, forced to withdraw money while someone stood beside her, driven miles away from home, and shot before sunrise. Her family was left trying to process the loss. Her friends were left trying to understand how this could happen to someone they had just seen. And investigators were beginning to follow the evidence, security footage, witness accounts, and the physical trail left behind. It was becoming clear that this case was moving quickly, and what they were about to uncover would explain how Eve's final hours unfolded and who was responsible. Eve Marie Carson was born on September 8, 1985, the first child of Bob and Teresa Carson. She grew up in a close-knit family alongside her younger brother, in a home where faith, education, and service were part of everyday life. Eve attended Clark Central High School in Athens, Georgia, where she graduated as valedictorian. From early on, it was clear she took her education seriously. Her teachers described her as bright and focused, someone who didn't just aim to succeed for herself, but who motivated the people around her to do better too. But academics were only part of who she was. She was involved in student government and regularly participated in service projects in her community. She wasn't waiting for leadership opportunities to come to her. She stepped into them naturally. Even then, people could see she was building skills that would carry into her future. At Clark Central, she developed a reputation not just for her grades, but for how she carried herself. She was disciplined, organized, and reliable. At the same time, she was approachable. Classmates felt comfortable talking to her. She wasn't distant or unrelatable. She was present and engaged. There was intention behind the choices she made. Friends would later say she wasn't uncertain about where she was headed. She was preparing for it. She understood that her actions now were shaping the life she wanted to build. After graduating, Eve enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She chose to major in political science and biology, a combination that reflected her wide range of interests and her curiosity about both people and systems. She cared about how institutions worked and how individuals could make a difference within them. Her academic performance quickly set her apart. She was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa, one of the country's oldest and most respected academic honor societies. She was also a Morehead Cain Scholar, one of the university's most selective and prestigious scholarships, awarded to students who demonstrated leadership, character, and academic excellence. But Eve's life at UNC wasn't limited to the classroom. She immersed herself in campus life almost immediately. She attended student government meetings. She participated in policy discussions. She worked on outreach efforts and took part in forums where students raised concerns about tuition, campus safety, and academic policy. She wasn't there to observe quietly. She was there to contribute, to understand, and to help shape decisions that affected the student body. By her senior year in 2007, she ran for student body president and won. It was a serious role with real responsibility. She met regularly with university administrators and represented more than 25,000 students. She listened to concerns, brought those issues forward, and worked to find solutions. The students who elected her trusted her to speak on their behalf. Those who knew her often talked about the way she led. She had clear ideas, but she also listened. She didn't assume she had all the answers. She paid attention to people, and that mattered. Outside of school, Eve also traveled internationally, volunteering in countries including Cuba, Egypt, Ecuador, and Ghana. She wanted to see the world beyond her own experience. She wanted to understand how people lived in different places and what challenges they faced. It wasn't about recognition. It was about learning and contributing where she could. In conversations, she spoke clearly and thoughtfully. She prepared. She took her responsibilities seriously. Professors described her as principled and engaged. Other students saw her as confident, but never dismissive or arrogant. She had direction. She had purpose. And by her senior year, she was standing at the edge of the life she had been working toward for years. Many people believed Eve had a future in law, politics, or nonprofit work. She had the academic background, the leadership experience, and the kind of presence that made people trust her. By the spring of 2008, she was only weeks away from graduating, weeks away from finishing college, weeks away from stepping into whatever came next. And that's what makes the timing so difficult to process. Because while Eve was spending her final year focused on classes, leadership, and service, somewhere beyond her daily routine, a completely different set of choices was unfolding. Choices that would eventually intersect with her life. On the 4th of March 2008, which was on a Tuesday, Eve moved through the day the way she usually did. She attended classes, she went to meetings, she had conversations about student issues and campus plans. Nothing about the day stood out as unusual. There were no public conflicts, no signs that anything was wrong. Friends would later say she spent that evening studying and being around people she knew and trusted. It was a normal night in Chapel Hill, the kind of night that didn't feel significant at the time. But sometime after midnight, that normal routine was interrupted. According to court testimony and investigative findings later reported by the News and Observer, CNN, and the Associated Press, a man entered Eve's off-campus apartment at Chapel Ridge. There was no indication that she knew him. Prosecutors would later say he confronted her at gunpoint inside her own home. He took her car keys and then he forced her into her vehicle. From that point on, everything began to move. In the early morning hours of March 5th, surveillance cameras captured images at ATM machines in Chapel Hill and Durham. The footage, which would later be shown in court, showed Eve at the machines while someone remained with her, controlling the situation. Authorities said she was not acting freely. Each ATM transaction created a timestamp. Each one marked a specific moment, a specific place, proof that she was still alive. Investigators would later determine that she was driven across county lines. Her vehicle appeared in multiple locations, captured briefly by cameras before moving on again. The pattern wasn't random. It showed direction, control. Whoever was with her was deciding where she went. Eventually, the movement stopped appearing on surveillance cameras. The trail of footage ended. At some point before sunrise, the car made its way toward White Cross Road, a quieter area outside the center of Chapel Hill. There were no ATM cameras there, no nearby businesses with surveillance, and no witnesses who, at that moment, understood what was happening. What happened next would later be explained in court. Eve was shot 5 times, but in those final moments, none of that was known yet. There were no sirens on the way, no officers searching the area, no alert sent out to campus. There was only a quiet stretch of road, hours before sunrise. Her body wouldn't be found until later that morning. And when it was, investigators turned quickly to the ATM footage. Those images became some of the most important evidence in the case. Police released still photos to the public, showing Eve at the machines with a man close beside her. They needed help identifying him. A manhunt began. But even early on, something didn't fully make sense. If this had only been a robbery, why take her miles away from the ATM locations? Why not leave once the money had been withdrawn? Why continue driving her from place to place? As detectives began mapping out the timeline, the ATM stops, the routes taken, the final location where she was found, they started to realize this case might not be as simple as it first appeared. Because Eve Carson was not the only person connected to this chain of events. And what investigators uncovered next expanded the case beyond a single night. By the afternoon of March 5th, Chapel Hill had changed. The quiet of the morning was gone. Law enforcement activity had spread across multiple locations. Investigators from the Chapel Hill Police Department, the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and state authorities were all working together. Evidence had been collected from White Cross Road. Eve's car had been located. Her apartment had been carefully examined, but some of the strongest leads came from surveillance cameras. The ATM footage, recovered within hours, showed a clear sequence of withdrawals during the early morning of March 5th. The images, later shared by media outlets and presented in court, showed a man using Eve's card while she remained under his control. Police released those images publicly. People began recognizing details. Tips started coming in almost immediately. According to reporting from the News and Observer and other North Carolina outlets at the time, investigators were able to quickly connect movements tied to the ATM transactions and the vehicle. The timeline was coming together faster than many homicide investigations typically do. Then, on March 7, just 2 days after Eve's body was discovered, authorities announced their first arrest. Demario James Atwater, 22 years old. Soon after, investigators identified a second suspect, Lawrence Levet. He was 17 at the time. Investigators soon confirmed that the evidence connected both suspects to Eve's car and the ATM withdrawals. Items recovered during the investigation helped strengthen that link. Prosecutors would later describe a pattern: multiple robberies tied to the same individuals in the days leading up to Eve's death. For students and staff at UNC, the arrests brought an initial sense of relief. There were names now, faces, people in custody. But that relief didn't last long. As detectives continued investigating, another case came into focus. Just 2 days before Eve was killed, on March 2008, a Duke University graduate student had been shot and killed in Durham. His name was Abhijit Mahato. Not long after Eve's murder, authorities charged Lawrence Levet in Mahato's killing as well. What had first seemed like a single devastating crime was now connected to another loss of life. 2 victims, 2 shootings, just days apart. Investigators began to see a pattern that hadn't been obvious at first. This wasn't a single act that happened in isolation. It was part of a series of violent crimes that had unfolded over multiple days. During press briefings, officials described what they believed was an ongoing robbery spree. Multiple incidents, multiple decisions, each one building on the last. And one fact stood out more than anything else. The suspects didn't know Eve. There was no personal history between them, no argument, no prior connection. According to prosecutors, she was chosen during a robbery. She wasn't targeted because of who she was personally, but because she happened to be there. But even with that explanation, the level of violence raised difficult questions. As the case moved toward court, many people believed the most urgent questions had already been answered. The suspects had been identified, they had been arrested, the legal process was underway. It felt like the path toward justice had begun. But inside the courtroom, more details would come out. Details about what happened inside Eve's apartment. Details about the movements captured on surveillance cameras. Details about the final stretch of White Cross Road. And as those facts were presented under oath, the reality of what she experienced in her final hours became clearer and harder for many people to fully process. By 2009, investigators had established what they believed was a clear timeline of the crime. Demario Atwater, the older of the 2 suspects, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He accepted responsibility for his role in Eve's death. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the case wasn't fully over yet. The younger suspect, Lawrence Levet, was 17 years old when Eve was killed. In 2011, he went to trial. The courtroom was filled. Students, faculty, journalists, and family members came to watch the proceedings. Eve's parents, Bob and Teresa Carson, were there too. They sat quietly as the case moved forward, listening as prosecutors and witnesses described what had happened to their daughter. Prosecutors walked the jury through the sequence of events step by step. They explained how Eve had been confronted inside her apartment and forced out at gunpoint. How she had been driven to multiple ATM locations and made to withdraw money. Surveillance footage showed those stops, confirming the timeline investigators had built. And eventually, they explained she was driven to White Cross Road. That's where she was shot 5 times. The case presented in court was detailed and carefully constructed. ATM timestamps, surveillance images, forensic reports, and witness testimony all fit together to show what had happened and when. Each piece added clarity, leaving little uncertainty about the sequence of events. But beyond the evidence itself, it was the human impact that stayed with people in the courtroom. Witnesses described Eve's behavior during those final hours. Even while under threat, she complied. She did what she was told. She stayed calm. Those details were difficult to hear, especially for the people who knew her. Levette's defense pointed to his age and argued that his role should be viewed in that context. Prosecutors, however, focused on the decisions that had been made over the course of that night. Decisions they said showed awareness, intent, and a willingness to continue the violence. After days of testimony, the jury reached its decision. Lawrence Levette was found guilty of first-degree murder in Eve Carson's death. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was also convicted in the murder of Abhijit Mahato, formally linking the two cases and confirming what investigators had already concluded, that both killings were part of the same series of crimes. Even with the verdict delivered, the outcome didn't bring simple closure. The court had established the facts. The people responsible had been identified and sentenced. But one question stayed with many people who followed the case. Why Eve? She hadn't known the attackers. There was no personal conflict, no warning signs. She became a victim during the course of a robbery, chosen not because of who she was, but because of circumstance. As the trial ended and people began to leave the courtroom, that reality stayed with them. The legal process had reached its conclusion. But for Eve's family, her friends, and the campus community, the loss itself didn't end there. And for many, the hardest part wasn't understanding what happened. It was accepting how quickly and how senselessly it had all been taken away. Could it have been prevented? Or was it the result of a series of choices and circumstances that came together in the worst possible way? The legal process had reached its conclusion. The people responsible had been identified, tried, and sentenced. But for the people who knew Eve, for her family, her friends, and her community, the questions didn't simply disappear. Because justice in a courtroom doesn't undo what was lost. After the trials ended, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, along with the broader community, had to face a painful reality. Eve Marie Carson was gone. No verdict, no sentence could bring her back. In the days after her death, students, faculty, and local residents gathered across campus for vigils. Thousands of people stood together holding candles. Some stood in silence, others cried. Many were still trying to process how someone so present in their daily lives could be taken so suddenly. It wasn't just grief, it was disbelief. Her parents, Bob and Teresa Carson, chose to speak publicly in the weeks and months that followed. In interviews covered by national outlets, including CNN, ABC News, and the New York Times, they talked about their daughter with honesty and love. They spoke about their pain, but they also spoke about forgiveness. They said they wanted people to remember Eve for how she lived, not only for how she died. Their words reached far beyond Chapel Hill. In Eve's honor, the university created scholarships and memorial programs designed to support students who showed leadership and a commitment to helping others. These efforts were meant to carry forward the values Eve had lived by. Her name became part of something ongoing, a reminder of the impact one person can have on the people around them. And yet, even with those efforts, the loss was still deeply felt. Prosecutors described her murder as a robbery. She wasn't targeted because of her leadership role, her achievements, or any personal conflict. She happened to cross paths with people who chose violence. That reality was difficult for many to accept. For her friends, it meant moving forward without someone who had been a constant part of their lives. For students she had mentored, it meant losing someone they looked up to. For her family, it meant living with a space that could never truly be filled. Her death also led to broader conversations about safety. Universities across the country began taking a closer look at off-campus housing security, transportation options at night, and emergency alert systems. People wanted to know what could be done differently, what could be improved. But even as policies changed and memorials were created, one truth remained. Eve wasn't just a name in a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a leader, and her absence was felt in every space she once occupied. Eve's story is a reminder of how quickly life can change, even for someone who seemed to be doing everything right. She was focused, she cared about people, she believed in service, in leadership, and in using her time to make a difference. That's part of what makes her loss so difficult to accept. Even after the arrests, the trials, and the convictions, some questions never fully go away. People still wonder if anything could have been done differently, if there was a moment where the outcome might have changed, if the safety measures and conversations that followed her death could have made a difference had they existed sooner. Those questions don't have easy answers. What remains clear is the impact she left behind. At Chapel Hill, her name continues to be part of the community. Scholarships created in her honor support students who share her commitment to leadership and service. Each year, people still gather to remember her, not only for what happened, but for who she was and what she stood for. For students, her story became more than a tragedy. It became a reminder that leadership isn't just about holding a position, it's about how you show up for others, how you listen, how you care. The legal system delivered its outcome. The people responsible were held accountable. But the emotional reality is different. Loss doesn't end when a trial ends. Eve Carson's legacy isn't defined by the violence that took her life. It's defined by the way she lived, by the example she set, the people she helped, and the future she was working toward. She was 22 years old, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student leader preparing for graduation. And for those who knew her, and even those who only learned her story later, she remains a reminder of how much one person can mean to so many people. Thank you for watching Murder Ledger. We explore real cases, unanswered questions, and the details that refuse to fade. If these stories matter to you, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments.